Today's video is sponsored by Audible. When I was younger, I loved a good story, but as I got older, I found it harder and harder to find the time. Audible completely changed that and helped me rediscover that passion. So whether I'm working out, cooking dinner, driving, or yes, even working on an episode just like this one, Audible helps inspire me with the perfect audiobook. Start listening with a free 30-day Audible trial and get full access to thousands and thousands of all-you-can-listen audiobooks, original entertainment, and podcasts included in the Plus catalog. Visit audible.com/commandersquarters or text Commander's Quarters to 500-500. You can find the link below in the description. As an Audible member, you will get 1 credit every month, good for any title in the entire premium selection. Ever since I started listening to Audible, I have been devouring audiobooks, and these credits help me continue to enjoy more amazing stories. Lately, they have been helping me continue with one particularly incredible story. So, I would like to recommend to you one of my new personal favorites thanks to Audible with The Way of Kings. From #1 New York Times best-selling author Brandon Sanderson, The Way of Kings Book 1 of the Stormlight Archive begins an incredible new saga of epic proportion. It has been centuries since the fall of the 10 consecrated orders known as the Knights Radiant, but their shard blades and shard plate remain. Mystical swords and suits of armor that transform ordinary men into near-invincible warriors. Men trade kingdoms for shard blades, wars were fought for them and won by them. One such war rages on a ruined landscape called the Shattered Plains, where 10 armies fight separately against a single foe. And thanks to Audible, you can get The Way of Kings for free by either visiting audible.com/commandersquarters or by texting Commander's Quarters to 500-500 to get started with your free 30-day Audible trial today. So, spoiler season is back. Okay, well, kind of, ish. Officially, spoiler season starts next week on the 29th. But as Wizards likes to do, sometimes they surprise us with some early spoilers. And today we got some really exciting new spoilers with a new mechanic revealed with dungeons. And no, your eyes are not fooling you right now. The cards that you're seeing on the screen are actual Magic cards. Yeah, we've been getting some real, let's just say, interesting and unique new ways that Magic cards can be made and new ways that they can look. And this might just be the most off-the-wall card design and mechanic of all time. So what are dungeons and how do they work? Well, let's jump into it to find out. Now, a while back I came out with an episode, What is the Dungeon Mechanic? Because on a spoiled card I saw the phrase, venture into the dungeon, which would make one think that there's a new dungeon mechanic, and yes, that was correct. But now with this episode, you get to see just how right or wrong I was about my guesses on what the dungeon mechanic was. Anyways, Cloister Gargoyle is a 0/4 gargoyle, and when it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. It also says as long as you've completed a dungeon, Cloister Gargoyle gets +3/+0 and has flying. So dungeons are something that can be ventured into or completed. Now, of course, there are going to be plenty of cards outside of Cloister Gargoyle that involve entering the dungeon with things like Shortcut Seeker. This is a brand new card that was just spoiled, a 2/5 human rogue that says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. And on this card, we get the reminder text to see exactly what that means. That means enter the first room or advance to the next room. Now, there are exactly 3 dungeons in this set, so let's look at one of them to talk about how this mechanic actually works and what the dungeon actually does. So let's jump into the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and yeah, the first time that you look at this, like the first time I looked at it, you might be just thinking, oh my goodness, that is a lot to take in. And you're right, but don't worry about it, I will walk you through it. So according to the Wizards article on it, dungeons don't go in your deck, rather they start outside the game and end up in the command zone for a while. More on that later. You always have access to all 3 dungeons, and you'll never need more than one of the same one. The way to bring dungeons into the game is a new keyword action, venture into the dungeon. So we saw that on both Cloister Gargoyle and Shortcut Seeker, and I'm sure there are going to be plenty of other cards coming up as well. Back to Wizards though, if you venture into the dungeon while you don't have any dungeons in the command zone, meaning you're not in a dungeon, it's time to start your journey. Put the dungeon of your choice into the command zone and put a venture marker on the first room at the top. So essentially when you're venturing into the dungeon, you're not actually playing the card, you're just putting it in your command zone, and then you start off at the first room with your marker. So your marker can pretty much be whatever you want, whether that's a dice or a quarter or a D&D mini or whatever you want there. But it probably will be most effective if it's small. Regardless, each and every time you enter a room, including that first room, that room ability triggers. So for the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, the first room is called Yawning Portal, and that's where you start. And when that room ability triggers, you gain 1 life. Now, gaining 1 life really isn't all that powerful, but as you'll notice, the further into the dungeon you get, the bigger the effects get. Now that you're actually in the dungeon, the next time that you venture into the dungeon, actually venturing further into the dungeon, you move to the next room. So that room would be dungeon level, and the room ability that triggers would be Scry 1. Now, a rule clarification here for a question that I definitely had. After you start a dungeon, you must continue in that dungeon, and you can't start another dungeon until you finish this one. So essentially, 1 dungeon at a time, please. Which D&D wise definitely makes sense because you can't just, pick up and leave your dungeon and then come back to the dungeon in the exact same spot. Regardless, now our next step is a bit unique because we actually have a room choice. So when we venture further into the dungeon, we can either go into the Goblin Bazaar or the Twisted Caverns. We cannot do both. Again, when you're in the dungeon, you need to follow the arrows, which are all down arrows. So if we choose to go into Goblin Bazaar, we can create a treasure token. If we choose to go into Twisted Caverns, target creature can't attack until your next turn. So depending on the situation that we're in, we're going to pick one or the other. If we need a little extra mana, well, that treasure token could come in really handy. But if there's a big bad creature out there and we don't want it to hit us, well, we can make it so it can't attack. Regardless, both of these rooms go to the same place when we venture further, and that would be the Lost level, which has us Scry 2. From there, we've got a decision between the Runestone Caverns and Mural's Graveyard. With the Caverns, we get to exile the top 2 cards of our library and play them. Keep in mind you still gotta pay the mana cost for that. And if we go to the Graveyard, we get 2 1/1 black skeleton creature tokens. Following that up, we get yet another Scry room with Deep Mines where we're going to Scry 3. So obviously, the power of the room ability trigger continues to grow throughout the dungeon. And in the final room, we've got the Mad Wizard's Lair, which is a huge effect. It says draw 3 cards and reveal them. You may cast one of them without paying its mana cost. So yeah, drawing 3 cards and be able to cast one for free is pretty fantastic. If we hit something huge, our opponents are going to be in big trouble. Now, after that ability resolves, the dungeon is removed from the game. And because of that, the dungeon is considered completed. So looking back at Cloister Gargoyle, after that happens, it's going to get +3/+0 and has flying. Now it doesn't matter if Cloister Gargoyle was actually in play for this. If we played it after we completed the dungeon, it doesn't matter. As long as we've completed 1 dungeon, Cloister Gargoyle gets bigger. And of course, there are going to be other cards that have dungeon completion benefits, like Gloomstalker. This is a new card that was revealed, a 2/3 Dwarf Ranger that says as long as you've completed a dungeon, Gloomstalker has Double Strike. And I'm sure there are going to be plenty of other cards in this set that care about a dungeon being completed. Now, personally, I am really hoping to see a card that cares about all 3 dungeons being completed and winning you the game, because I think that would be pretty cool. But we shall see if that actually happens. Now, as of right now, including all the cards in this set, there are no cards that are going to allow other players to interfere with your dungeon or the venture marker on your dungeon. But although you can't remove a dungeon, you could still, say, counter a room ability trigger with something like Disallow. Disallow says counter target spell, activate ability, or triggered ability, and yes, that room ability trigger is a triggered ability. Regardless, there are only so many cards that do this. And one more thing that I probably should have mentioned earlier, but Sheldon from the Rules Committee has confirmed that dungeons will be legal in Commander. This might be somewhat surprising to some, as the lesson mechanic, which came in Strixhaven, is not legal in Commander. Obviously, these are 2 separate mechanics, but both deal with cards being outside the game. But with all that said, let's jump into the other 2 dungeons. First up, we've got the Lost Mine of Phandelver. In the first room, you've got the cave entrance, which says Scry 1. From there, you've got 2 room options with Goblin Lair and Mine Tunnels. Goblin Lair says create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and Mine Tunnel says create a treasure token. So if you wanted that goblin token from the Goblin Lair room, you can move to either the storeroom or the dark pool. In the storeroom, you put a +1 counter on target creature. And with the dark pool, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And actually, the Mine Tunnels can also lead to the Dark Pool, but instead it also leads to the Fungi Cavern. And the Fungi Cavern says target creature gets -4/-0 until your next turn. And the final room is Temple of Dumathoin, where you draw a card. So with this dungeon, you only need to venture 4 times to actually complete it, unlike the last dungeon where you ventured 7 times. So because of that, obviously the payoffs are going to be less. But this one still gives you great options, and if you want to complete the dungeon quicker for those benefits, then this is probably a better pick. But the quickest dungeon is actually our last dungeon with Tomb of Annihilation. When we venture into the first room, that's going to be trapped entry, which says each player loses 1 life. And from there, we have an interesting choice. We can choose the path on the left, which has 2 rooms, or we can choose the room on the right. On the left, we'll venture into the room Veils of Fear. It says each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card. And from there, we go to Sandfall Cell, which says each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact, creature, or a land. Now, if instead from trapped entry we chose to go on the right path, we'd be going into Oubliette. It says discard a card and sacrifice an artifact, creature, and a land. So essentially this is a shortcut, but it comes at a big cost to us. Unlike the left side, which had 2 rooms, and it's going to come at a cost to everyone. Regardless, whichever path we picked, either the left or the right, they both finish in the final room, which is Cradle of the Death God. With that room trigger, we create the Atropal, a legendary 4/4 Black God Horror creature token with Death Touch. So again, technically this dungeon can be completed the quickest out of all the dungeons if we choose that right path. We can venture either 4 or 3 times to complete it. Regardless, each of these dungeons are quite unique, so you've got quite the choice to make when you venture into one of them. If you really need to complete a dungeon quickly and you're okay with the cost, Tomb of Annihilation is probably going to be your pick. If you're okay with a slightly slower pace and you want some benefits, Mine of Phandelver. Or if you're okay taking your time completing your dungeon to have the biggest impact, Dungeon of the Mad Mage is probably where you're gonna go. Regardless, after you do complete a dungeon, it's removed from the game, and then when you venture into a dungeon the next time, you can choose any of the 3 dungeons again. So even if you just completed Dungeon of the Mad Mage, you can jump right back in. Now, like I said, this set only has 3 dungeons, and you're seeing them right now. But I am really excited to see all the cards that are going to work with dungeons. So whether that's venturing into the dungeon or cards that get a benefit once you've completed a dungeon, I really can't wait to see it. And again, please, please, please let there be a card that wins you the game if you completed all 3 dungeons. But now it's time for me to hear from you. What do you think? What do you think about this new mechanic? And do you think that card is going to exist? So let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.